In 1925, the most famous explorer in the world walked into the unexplored Amazon and simply ceased to exist. Welcome back to the channel. Before we begin our descent into the green hell, I want to say a quick thank you to everyone joining us tonight. Let me know in the comments down below where you are listening from right now. I always love seeing how far these stories travel, whether you are in the UK, the US, or somewhere in between. Now, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let the rain wash everything else away. Colonel Percy Fawcett was looking for a lost civilization he called Zed. He believed a glittering city was hidden deep in the Brazilian jungle. He took his son, his best friend, and enough supplies for 2 years. They sent one final letter home saying, "You need have no fear of any failure." Then they stepped into the trees. For the next 70 years, over 100 rescue workers died trying to find them. Some were killed by tribes, some went mad, and some just vanished like Fawcett. But to understand how 3 men can vanish into thin air, we first have to understand the man who led them there, a man who didn't believe in fear. This is the story of the lost city of Z. Chapter 1. The Man of Steel. To understand the tragedy that was waiting in 1925, we first have to understand the man who walked toward it, because Percy Harrison Fawcett was not a normal man. In the parlance of his time, he was made of sterner stuff. Born in 1867 in Torquay, England, Fawcett was a product of the late Victorian era, a time when the British Empire was obsessed with filling in the blank spaces on the map. But Fawcett wasn't born into glory. He was born into a rigid, discipline-heavy military family. His father, Edward, was an equerry to the Prince of Wales, a man who believed in order, hierarchy, and silence. Young Percy learned early on that the world did not care if you were cold, or hungry, or tired. Pain was something to be ignored. Comfort was a luxury for weaker men. He was sent into the Royal Artillery and stationed in the humid garrisons of Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka. And it was there, in the stifling heat of the colony, that he realized 2 things about himself. First, he was bored by civilization, the endless dinner parties, the stiff collars, the polite conversation of colonial officers. It all felt like a cage. He craved the raw, the wild, the unknown. And second, he realized that he had an iron constitution. While other men in his regiment withered away from dysentery, malaria, and heat stroke, Fawcett remained untouched. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He ate sparingly. He discovered that his body was a machine that could run on almost nothing, but he was also a man of deep contradictions. While he was a disciplined soldier on the outside, on the inside, he was a mystic. In Ceylon, he became fascinated with Buddhism and theosophy, the belief in hidden knowledge and spiritual planes. He didn't just want to map the world, he wanted to find the magic hidden inside it. This belief, that the world held ancient secrets waiting for the worthy, would become the engine of his obsession. In 1901, seeking an escape from the boredom of army life, he joined the Royal Geographical Society in London to learn the trade of surveying. Surveying is the art of measuring the earth, turning chaos into lines and coordinates. It is a precise mathematical job, and Fawcett was a prodigy. The RGS saw something in him. They saw a man who didn't complain, a man who could walk for 20 miles, hack through brush, and then sit down and draw a perfect map by candlelight. In 1906, they gave him his first real test. The governments of Bolivia and Brazil were arguing over their border in the Amazon. It was a lawless, violent region, fueled by the rubber boom. They needed a neutral party to go in, walk the river lines, and mark the border. It was considered a suicide mission. The region was known as the Green Hell for a reason. It wasn't just the jaguars or the anacondas. It was the microscopic killers, the yellow fever that turned men's skin to parchment, the Aspundia parasite that ate away the soft tissue of the face, and the savages, the uncontacted tribes who shot 6-foot arrows with lethal accuracy. Fawcett took the job immediately. When he entered the Amazon for the first time, he didn't go in like the other Victorian explorers. He didn't bring a massive caravan of porters carrying fine wines, canvas bathtubs, and silver cutlery. He saw those expeditions for what they were, slow, loud, and doomed. Fawcett developed a philosophy of travelling light. He took only a handful of men. He ate what the jungle provided, surviving on monkey meat, piranha, and palm hearts. He wore light clothing. He moved fast, slipping through the trees like a ghost rather than marching through like an army. And the jungle tested him. On that first expedition, his boat was swept away by rapids. He lost supplies. His partners fell ill, delirium taking their minds before their bodies gave out. But Fawcett just kept walking. There are stories from this time that sound like myths. It is said that he was once bitten by a wandering spider, a creature whose venom can kill a child in minutes. Fawcett simply noted the pain in his journal, drank some whiskey, and continued working. Another time, his raft was surrounded by piranhas after capsizing. While his men panicked, scrambling for the muddy bank, Fawcett calmly salvaged the equipment, standing waist-deep in the churning water. He seemed to have a force field around him. The natives began to look at him with a mix of fear and reverence. He wasn't just a white man, he was something else, a spirit that could not be killed. By the time he returned to London, the legend was cemented. He was the David Livingstone of South America. He was awarded the Founders Medal by the RGS. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, attended Fawcett's lectures. He sat in the front row, mesmerized by Fawcett's descriptions of massive plateaus rising out of the mist, so mesmerized that he went home and wrote The Lost World, a book about dinosaurs surviving on a South American mountain. But Fawcett wasn't interested in fame. He wasn't interested in fiction. He had seen things in the jungle that didn't make sense. He had seen pottery shards in the mud, where no tribes lived. He had seen strange geometric shapes in the forest floor that looked like roads. He had heard legends from the indigenous elders about cities that shone like the stars, deep in the uncharted Xingu region. The academics in London laughed at him. They believed the Amazon was a counterfeit paradise, a place where the soil was too poor to support large civilizations. They believed the natives were simple hunter-gatherers, incapable of building cities. Fawcett looked at them with contempt. He knew what he had seen. He knew that under the canopy of the green hell, something was hiding, something ancient, and he decided that he was the only man alive, strong enough to find it. He called it simply Z. Chapter 2, Manuscript 512. The seed of Percy Fawcett's destruction was not planted in the jungle. It was planted in a library. In 1920, Fawcett was prowling the dusty, dimly lit archives of the National Library of Rio de Janeiro. He was looking for proof. He knew in his gut that the academics in London were wrong. He knew the Amazon was not a primitive wasteland. He believed it was the cradle of a lost civilization that predated the Incas, a civilization that had been swallowed by the vines. But belief is not enough for the Royal Geographical Society. He needed evidence. He found it in a box of rotting, worm-eaten papers labeled Relatorio Historico. It was a document that officially did not exist. It was fragile, the paper turning to dust at the edges. The ink faded to a pale brown that was barely legible against the yellowed parchment. It was catalogued simply as Manuscript 512. The title was long, bureaucratic, and unassuming. Historical relation of a hidden and great city of ancient date, discovered in the year 1753. As Fawcett began to translate the archaic Portuguese, his heart began to hammer against his ribs. This was not a legend. This was not a campfire story told by delirious rubber tappers. This was a field report. It was a 10-page detailed journal written by a bandeirante, a Portuguese fortune hunter, who had led an expedition into the unknown interior of Bahia in 1753. To understand the weight of this document, you have to understand the men who wrote it. The bandeirantes were not scientists. They were slavers, mercenaries, and gold hunters. They were brutal, violent men who cared only for profit. They did not write poetry, and they did not make up fairy tales. If a bandeirante wrote something down, it was because he wanted to find his way back to it to loot it. The manuscript told the story of a large expedition that had spent 10 years wandering the Sertão, the harsh, arid backlands of Brazil. They were looking for the legendary lost mines of Muribeca. By 1753, they were starving, their clothes were rotting off their bodies, and they were lost. According to the text, the expedition was hacking through thick vegetation when they saw a mountain range in the distance that glittered in the sun. They thought it was studded with crystals or diamonds. Driven by greed, they marched toward it. When they arrived, they found a range of mountains so steep and impossible that they spent days trying to find a way up. Finally, a lucky volunteer chased a white deer up a hidden trail, a cleft in the rock that had been artificially paved. They climbed the trail for 3 hours. When they reached the summit, they looked down into the valley below, and they fell to their knees. There, nestled in the bowl of the mountains, was a massive, sprawling city. The manuscript describes it in meticulous detail. It was not a village of thatch huts. It was a metropolis of stone. The writer describes entering the city at dawn. They were terrified, expecting to be attacked by the inhabitants, so they sent out scouts. The scouts returned with news that chilled them to the bone. The city was empty. The expedition descended the mountain and walked through the gates. The architecture was described as cyclopean, immense blocks of stone fitted together without mortar, similar to the Inca masonry in Peru, but far grander. They walked down a wide street lined with multi-story buildings. The houses were dark, the windows gaping like dead eyes. Inside, they found furniture that disintegrated when they touched it. They found pottery of exquisite quality, but they found no bodies, no skeletons. It was as if the people had simply stood up and walked away 1,000 years ago. The writer describes walking into a vast central plaza. In the center stood a colossal column of black stone, and on top of it, the statue of a man pointing toward the north. In the corners of the plaza were obelisks, covered in strange hieroglyphs that none of the men could read. They were not Portuguese, not Spanish, and certainly not the simple markings of indigenous tribes. They looked, the writer said, like Greek or Phoenician letters. The atmosphere in the city was heavy. The silence was suffocating. The men felt like they were being watched by the stone statues that lined the streets. The manuscript mentions a great palace, or citadel dominating the city, but the explorers were too afraid to enter its depths. Down by the river that cut through the city, the treasure hunters found their prize. In the rubble of the riverbank, they found gold coins. One of the men picked up a gold coin that depicted a figure kneeling, holding a bow. It was proof that this place had once been wealthy beyond imagination. But the document gets stranger. The writer describes an encounter on the river. As they were exploring the outskirts in a canoe, they saw 2 people in the distance in another boat. They were described as having white skin and long flowing hair, dressed in clothing that looked European. The explorers called out to them, but the figures paddled away quickly and disappeared into the labyrinth of the waterways. The expedition stayed in the ruins for a short time, but fear began to set in. The place felt cursed. It felt wrong. They decided to leave, marching back down the mountain trail to the river Paraguaçu. Before they left, the leader of the expedition sat down at the entrance of a cave and copied the strange inscriptions he saw carved into the rock. This is the part of Manuscript 512 that drove Percy Fawcett mad. At the bottom of the crumbling page, the Portuguese explorer had drawn the symbols. Fawcett recognized them. He had seen similar markings on pottery shards in the jungle. He had seen them in the secret archives of Sri Lanka. To him, they were not random scratches. They were evidence of a transoceanic connection, proof that an ancient, highly advanced civilization had sailed from the Mediterranean or Atlantis and settled in the Amazon thousands of years before Columbus. The manuscript ends on a note of desperation. The writer says they are sending a messenger back to the governor to report the find, asking for reinforcements to claim the city for the King of Portugal. But there is no record of the messenger ever arriving. There is no record of the governor sending help. The expedition vanishes from history, leaving only this single, water-stained report that sat in a drawer for 170 years until Fawcett blew the dust off it. For Fawcett, Manuscript 512 was the smoking gun. It validated everything he believed. The location described in the manuscript, somewhere in the wild, unexplored Mato Grosso region, aligned perfectly with his own theories. He didn't see a fairy tale. He saw a road map. He believed the city described by the Bandeirantes was merely an outpost, a suburb of a much larger empire. He believed that deep in the Xingu Basin, protected by swamps and hostile tribes, lay the capital of this civilization, the city he called Za. He copied the strange symbols from the bottom of the manuscript into his private journal. He traced the route the Portuguese slavers had taken. He calculated the coordinates, and he realized that the city was still there, waiting for him. The silence of the stone streets was calling to him across the centuries. He told the Royal Geographical Society that the manuscript was authentic. He told them that the white Indians described in the text were the descendants of the original builders. He told them that he could find it, but he also knew something else. He knew why the city was empty. The manuscript mentioned that the ruins looked as if they had been devastated by a great earthquake. Fawcett believed that a cataclysm had wiped out the civilization, leaving only the stone, skeletons behind. He wasn't just looking for gold. He was looking for the history of the human race. As he held that fragile paper in the Rio Library, Percy Fawcett made a pact with himself. He would find that statue pointing north. He would walk down that wide stone street, or he would die trying. Manuscript 512 was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a summons. The green hell was waiting, and it had opened a door. Chapter 3, The Green Hell. It has many names. To the cartographers in London, sitting in their sterile, gas-lit offices, it was simply the Amazon basin. To the biologists, it was a miracle of evolution, the greatest ecosystem on Earth. But to the men who actually tried to walk through it in the 1920s, it had only one name. They called it the Green Hell, and it was a hell. We often romanticize the jungle today. We watch documentaries in high definition that show vibrant toucans, playful monkeys, and lush, beautiful canopies. We think of it as a garden, but to an explorer on foot, stripped of modern medicine and satellite phones, the Amazon is not a garden. It is a hostile organism designed to digest you. Percy Fawcett was walking into a wilderness the size of the continental United States. It was a place where the map simply stopped. Once you stepped past the last rubber outpost, you were entering a void where time, direction, and rescue did not exist. There were no roads, there were no trails, there was only the wall. The first thing that hits you is the heat. It is not the dry, baking heat of the desert that crisps the skin. It is a wet, suffocating blanket that settles into your lungs. The humidity sits at 100% almost constantly. It is a physical weight. Your clothes do not dry. Your boots rot off your feet while you are still wearing them. Leather turns to green mold in 48 hours. Iron rusts overnight. The air is so thick with moisture that breathing feels like inhaling hot soup. Men describe a sensation of drowning while standing on solid ground. The sweat does not evaporate. It just slicks the skin, trapping the heat inside the body until the internal temperature begins to rise to dangerous levels. And then there is the noise. The jungle is never silent. It screams. At dawn, the howler monkeys begin a chorus that sounds like the souls of the damned, a deep guttural roaring that travels for miles through the trees. It sounds like a jaguar fighting a demon. At night, the insect noise is deafening, a mechanical wall of sound that hits a decibel level rivaling a factory floor. It creates a sensory overload that makes true sleep impossible. You lie in your hammock, suspended in the dark, listening to a million things crawling, clicking, and hunting around you. But the true horror of the green hell is not the jaguars or the anacondas. The apex predators are rare, and they usually avoid humans. The things that kill you in the Amazon are the small things, the things you cannot shoot. The insects of the Amazon are a plague of biblical proportions. There are the pium flies, tiny biting gnats that descend in black clouds near the riverbanks. They do not sting. They possess jagged mouthparts that tear out tiny chunks of flesh, leaving streaks of blood that run down your face. Explorers wrote of going mad from the itching, scratching their skin until it was raw meat, opening wounds that would immediately become infected by the humidity. There are stories of men diving into the water just to escape the cloud, only to be forced back up for air where the flies were waiting. There are the Sauber ants, huge red soldiers that can strip a tree bare in a single night. They are relentless. If they invade your camp while you sleep, they will eat your clothes, they will eat your canvas tent, they will eat your food supplies before you wake up, and if you are too weak to move, they will eat you. And then there are the parasites. The Amazon is a biological weapons lab. There is the botfly, a creature from a nightmare. It lays its eggs on a mosquito. When the mosquito bites you, the eggs drop into the wound. The heat of your body hatches them, and the larvae burrow into your skin. They grow into spiky maggots that eat your flesh from the inside out. You can feel them moving. You can see them breathing through the hole in your arm. To get them out, you have to suffocate them with tobacco smoke or tree sap, and then squeeze them out, an agonizing process that leaves a gaping hole in your body. There is the kangaroo, the vampire fish, a tiny translucent catfish that is attracted to the scent of urea. It is the ultimate horror story of the Amazon. If you make the mistake of urinating in the river, it can swim up the stream and lodge itself inside the human body with backward-facing barbs. The pain is said to be so intense that victims have to be restrained to stop them from hurting themselves. This was the daily reality for Fawcett. Every single step was a battle against biology. Every leaf you brushed against could hide a bullet ant, whose sting feels like being shot with a handgun. Every branch you grabbed for support could be a disguised viper, but the water was no refuge. The rivers of the Amazon, the Xingu, the Dead Horse, the River of Doubt, were highways of death. The waters were murky, opaque brown ribbons that hid electric eels capable of stopping a human heart with a single shock. They hid freshwater stingrays buried in the mud, with barbs covered in necrotic venom that causes the flesh to rot away from the bone, and of course, the piranhas. While the movies exaggerate them, the reality is still terrifying. They are attracted to commotion and blood. A splash of blood in the water can trigger a feeding frenzy that strips a carcass to the bone in minutes. Even without blood, they are known to nip at the extremities of swimmers, taking toes and fingers. Beyond the animals, there was the invisible killer, disease. Malaria was the gatekeeper of the Amazon. It killed more men than the tribes ever did. It started with a headache, then the shakes, then a fever so high the brain began to cook. Men would hallucinate, babbling about home, about ice, about their mothers, before slipping into a coma. Then there was yellow fever, which turned the eyes gold and caused victims to vomit black blood. There was espundia, a parasitic infection transmitted by sandflies that eats away the soft cartilage of the nose and mouth, leaving the victim with a terrifying skeletal face. Survival rates for expeditions in the 1920s were terrifyingly low. It was common for a team of 20 men to go in, and for only 3 to come out. The jungle simply swallowed them. It digested them. But perhaps the most dangerous element of the Green Hell was the psychological toll. There is a phenomenon known as jungle madness. The claustrophobia of the canopy begins to weigh on you. You can walk for weeks and never see the sun, only the filtered green submarine light coming through the leaves. The lack of a horizon, the constant threat of death, and the isolation drives men to paranoia. You start to suspect your partners are hoarding food. You start to hear voices in the river. You start to see things in the trees. The monotony breaks the mind. Every day is the same green wall. Every step is the same struggle through vines that grab at your ankles like hands. The jungle feels conscious. It feels like it is watching you. It feels like it wants you to die. This is why Fawcett was so unique. He seemed immune to the Green Hell. He walked through this biological war zone with a calm, stoic determination. He didn't swat at the flies. He didn't complain about the heat. He treated the jungle not as an enemy, but as a test. He believed that if you respected the wild, if you moved quietly and didn't fight it, it would let you pass. But even Fawcett knew that the environment wasn't the only threat. The Green Hell had guardians. Deep in the unchecked regions of the Mato Grosso, there were tribes that had never made peace with the outside world. The Kalapalos, the Suya, the Savante. To them, white men were invaders. They were ghosts who brought sickness and slavery. These tribes were masters of their environment. They could move through the underbrush without snapping a twig. They could track a man by the scent of his sweat. They could mimic the calls of birds to signal each other, surrounding an expedition before the explorers even knew they were there. An expedition could be watched for weeks without ever knowing it. The only warning would be the sudden thwip of a 6-foot arrow flying from the darkness, tipped with curare poison that paralyzed the lungs in seconds, leaving the victim fully conscious as they suffocated. This was the world Percy Fawcett marched his son into. He wasn't walking into a park. He wasn't walking into an adventure. He was walking into a meat grinder. He was walking into a place where biology had been perfecting the art of killing for millions of years. And he believed that somewhere, in the center of this hostility, there was a city of gold waiting to be found. He believed the Green Hell was just the wall around the garden. He was wrong. It was the tomb. Chapter 4. The Early Failures. The legend of Percy Fawcett was not built on success. It was built on a terrifying capacity to endure failure. Before the final famous disappearance in 1925, Fawcett launched a series of expeditions that would have killed a lesser man. These were not adventures. They were slow-motion catastrophes. They were brutal lessons in the reality of the Amazon, lessons that stripped away Fawcett's faith in professional explorers and convinced him that the only people he could trust were his own blood. To understand why he eventually took his 21-year-old son into the void, we have to look at the wreckage of the trips that came before. The most significant of these failures began in 1920. Fawcett was 53 years old. In the world of exploration, he was an old man. Most of his peers were retired, sitting in leather chairs in London clubs, nursing their gout and telling exaggerated war stories. But Fawcett was possessed. The discovery of Manuscript 512 had lit a fire in his brain that could not be extinguished. He secured funding, not from the Royal Geographical Society this time, but from private investors who were seduced by his talk of lost civilizations and potential gold. He assembled a team. This was his first mistake. He brought 2 men with him, a muscular athletic boxer named A.J. Rimington and a young man named Holt. On paper they looked perfect. They were fit, strong, and eager for glory. They looked like the kind of men who could conquer the wild. But the Amazon does not care about how much you can bench press. It cares about your mind. The expedition began in disaster and only got worse. They traveled into the interior of the Mato Grosso, moving toward the Cullen River. The rainy season hit them early. The trails turned into rivers of mud that sucked the boots off their feet. The horses, which were essential for carrying their supplies, began to suffer. It was on this trip that the infamous Dead Horse Camp was born. One of their pack animals, exhausted and starving, collapsed in the mud. Fawcett, unsentimental and pragmatic, shot the animal to end its misery. But the death of the horse was a symbol of what was happening to the team. They were breaking down. Rimington and Holt began to deteriorate. The constant wetness caused their feet to rot. They developed trench foot, their skin turning white and sloughing off in chunks. They were covered in ulcers from insect bites, but worse than the physical pain was the psychological shock. They had expected a grand adventure. They found only misery. They began to complain. They wanted to rest. They wanted more food. They wanted to go home. To Fawcett, this was not just annoying. It was, disgusting. Fawcett viewed weakness as a moral failing. He watched his companions limp and whine, and he felt nothing but contempt. In his journals, he wrote about them with a cold, detached fury. He called them soft. He couldn't understand why they couldn't just ignore the pain like he did. He stopped seeing them as partners and started seeing them as dead weight. The tension in the camp became dangerous. Starvation changes men. It strips away the veneer of civilization. Rimington, the boxer, became aggressive. There were moments where hands hovered over pistol grips. The jungle had reduced them to animals, snarling at each other over a handful of beans. Fawcett realized that he was dragging two corpses through the forest. If he continued, they would die, and he would likely die with them, burdened by their incompetence. He had to make the hardest decision of his life. He was closer to the city of Z than he had ever been. He could feel it, but he had to turn back. The retreat was a humiliation. They limped back to civilization, defeated, sick, and broken. Fawcett returned to Rio de Janeiro, not as a hero, but as a man who had failed. He had looked into the promised land and been forced to walk away because of the weakness of others. But the 1920 failure was not the only one. There was a solo attempt, a brief foray, where he tried to go it alone, only to be turned back by the sheer impossibility of carrying enough supplies. There were diplomatic failures, where the Brazilian government refused him permits, thinking he was a spy or a madman. Year after year, from 1920 to 1924, Fawcett sat in civilization, seething. He watched the world change. The Jazz Age was starting. Cars were filling the streets. The world was becoming modern, loud, and soft. He felt like a man out of time. He was a Victorian relic trapped in the 20th century. And as he sat in his home, looking at maps, a dark realization took root in his mind. He realized that he could never trust a stranger again. He couldn't trust a scientist because they were too arrogant. He couldn't trust a soldier because they needed orders. He couldn't trust an adventurer because they only wanted glory. He needed someone who was an extension of himself, someone he could mold, someone who would not question him, someone whose loyalty was biological. He looked at his son, Jack. Jack Fawcett was 21 years old. He was tall, strong, and incredibly handsome, a movie star look-alike who had spent his life worshipping his father. Jack had never been to the Amazon. He had never suffered the bite of a bullet ant or the shake of malaria. He was innocent. But to Percy, that was perfect. Jack was a blank slate. He hadn't been ruined by the softness of city life. Percy began to train Jack not as a son, but as a disciple. He put him on a strict diet. He forbade him from drinking alcohol. He taught him that the body was just a vessel that must be mastered by the will. He convinced Jack that finding Z was their destiny, a holy crusade that they were chosen to complete. He also recruited Jack's best friend, Raleigh Grimel. Raleigh was a joker, a light-hearted kid who liked to play the ukulele. He was the opposite of the serious Fawcetts, but he was loyal to Jack, and Percy figured that was enough. The failure of 1920 had hardened Fawcett's heart. He was done with caution. He was done with teams of experts. He was done with the possibility of turning back. When he began planning the 1925 expedition, he made a chilling decision. He told the Royal Geographical Society that he would not be taking a radio. He claimed it was too heavy, that it would weigh them down. But the truth was darker. He didn't want a radio because he didn't want to be called back, and he didn't want to be able to call for help. He was burning the ships. He was creating a scenario where there was only one way out, forward. He looked at the failures of the past, the rotting feet of Remington, the dead horses, the complaining men, and he swore that this time nothing would stop him. He would take his son, he would take his map, and he would walk until he found the city, or until the jungle buried them both. The failures of the past had cleared the path for the final tragedy. The stage was set, the players were chosen, and the green hell was waiting to finish what it started 5 years ago. Chapter 5. The Three Explorers. By January 1925, the die was cast. The years of failure, the rotting boots, and the screaming arguments with soft partners were over. Percy Fawcett had built his final machine, and this time it was small, lean, and intimately loyal. He called it The Three. To the newspapers in London and New York, this was the adventure of the century. The North American Newspaper Alliance had bought the exclusive rights to Fawcett's dispatches. They painted a picture of a romantic, daring quest into the unknown, a real-life Jules Verne story. But if you look closely at the three men standing on the deck of the ocean liner Vauban as it steamed toward Rio de Janeiro, you saw a very different story. You saw a tragedy waiting to unfold. You saw three men who were walking toward a cliff edge, holding hands. First, there was the commander. Colonel Percy Fawcett was now 57 years old. In 1925, in the world of hard exploration, that was considered elderly. His hair was thinning, his face was weathered like old leather cured in salt and sun, and his eyes burned with a fanatical intensity that unnerved people who held his gaze for too long. He was a man who had backed himself into a corner. He had liquidated his assets. He had sold his home in England. He had put every penny he owned, and every penny he could borrow, into this trip. There was no retirement plan. There was no plan B. He was a man who knew that if he came back without the city of Z, he would be a destitute laughingstock. He had to win, or he had to die. There was no middle ground. Second, there was the sun. Jack Fawcett was the physical embodiment of his father's theories. He was 21 years old, 6 feet 3 inches tall, and built like a Greek statue. He was strong, athletic, and painfully eager to please. But Jack was not an explorer. He was a creation. Percy had raised Jack specifically for this moment. Since the boy was a child, Percy had been moulding him, shaping him into the perfect companion for the great discovery. He had shielded him from the vices of the modern world. Jack did not smoke. He did not drink alcohol. He had never been with a woman. Percy had filled Jack's head with theosophy and mysticism, telling the boy that he was a chosen soul, a spirit destined to help discover the cradle of civilization. Jack worshipped his father. He didn't see a desperate old man. He saw a prophet. But Jack had never walked a mile in the jungle. He had never seen a piranha. He had never felt the crushing weight of isolation. He was a soldier who had only ever marched on a parade ground, about to be dropped into the trenches of the First World War. And third, there was the friend, Raleigh Rimmel. If Jack was the golden boy, Raleigh was the tragic mistake. He was Jack's best friend, a childhood companion, who was invited along almost as an afterthought to keep Jack company. Raleigh was 22, smaller than Jack, wiry and darker featured. He was the joker of the group. He brought a ukulele with him. He was a clown, a kid looking for a lark, a story to tell girls back in England. Raleigh Rimmel had absolutely no business being in the Amazon. He didn't share the Fawcett's mystical obsession. He didn't have their iron discipline. He was just a kid who said yes to a cool trip. And from the moment they landed in Brazil, the cracks began to show. Raleigh was a city boy. He was used to comfort. He was used to noise. He had no idea that he was stepping into a world that would slowly dismantle him, piece by piece. When they arrived in Rio, the heat hit them. While Percy strode through the streets with his usual grim determination, and Jack tried to mimic his father's posture, Raleigh was already sweating, uncomfortable and anxious. He looked at the dark green mountains looming over the city, and perhaps for the first time, he realized this wasn't a game. The preparation in Brazil was a study in minimalism. Fawcett was obsessed with traveling light. He looked at the massive expeditions of the past, hundreds of crates, folding tables, heavy canvas tents, cases of champagne, and he threw it all away. He believed that the only way to survive the green hell was to move like the animals did, fast and light. He believed that large expeditions were slow targets that attracted disease and hostile tribes. They packed only the essentials. The manifest was terrifyingly sparse. Each man carried a backpack that weighed roughly 40 pounds. That was their entire world. Inside there was a hammock. Fawcett knew that sleeping on the ground was a death sentence due to the ants and snakes, a fine mesh mosquito net. This was their only shield against the malaria that had killed thousands before them, a 44 caliber Winchester rifle and a revolver. These were for hunting, but also for defense against the savages Fawcett expected to meet. A machete, the key to the jungle. Without it, you could not move a single foot through the undergrowth. And food, but not enough food. They carried tinned kits, corned beef, powdered milk, sugar, chocolate, and rice. It was enough to last them about 3 weeks. For a trip that was supposed to take a year or more, this was suicide math. Fawcett's plan was to live off the land. He assumed they would shoot monkeys and birds every day. He assumed the jungle would provide. It was a gamble that ignored the reality of the Amazon. Sometimes the jungle is empty. Sometimes you walk for weeks without seeing a single living thing to eat. There was one piece of equipment that was conspicuously missing: a radio. The technology existed. Wireless sets were heavy, yes, but they were usable. The newspapers begged Fawcett to take one so they could track his progress. The Royal Geographical Society strongly suggested it. Fawcett refused. He claimed it was too heavy, that the batteries wouldn't last, but his true motives were likely more paranoid. He told a friend, "I have no intention of being chased by rescue parties." He didn't want to be found. He didn't want anyone to steal his discovery. He wanted to disappear. He was cutting the cord. They took a train from the coast, chugging inland toward the frontier town of Corumba. As the train moved west, the cities faded. The paved roads turned to dirt, then to mud. The stone buildings turned to wood, then to thatch. They were traveling back in time. The dynamic in the train car was telling. Percy sat with his maps, silent, calculating coordinates, his mind already living in the city of Z. Jack sat opposite him, cleaning his rifle, trying to look brave, trying to be the man his father wanted him to be. And Raleigh sat by the window, strumming his ukulele, watching the civilization he knew roll away, replaced by the endless tangled wall of green. He was watching his life disappear. They arrived at the end of the line. The dead horse camp lay ahead. The unknown lay ahead. The 3 explorers stood on the precipice of the world. They looked like heroes in the photographs, handsome, armed, and ready. But the jungle doesn't care about photographs. It was watching them, and it was waiting. They were about to step off the map, and they were bringing their ghosts with them. Chapter 6. Crossing the Rubicon. The Rubicon is a river in Italy that Julius Caesar crossed with his army, an act of treason that meant there was no turning back. In April 1925, Percy Fawcett, his son Jack, and Raleigh Rumel stood on the banks of their own Rubicon. It wasn't a single river, it was the invisible, suffocating line between the known world and the void. They had arrived in Cuiabá, the capital of the Mato Grosso state. In 1925, Cuiabá was the literal end of the line for civilization. It was a dusty, sun-baked frontier town where the streets were paved with jagged stones and the buildings were crumbling colonial relics, their whitewashed walls stained by the red dust of the interior. It was a place of gold prospectors, diamond hunters, and fugitives running from the law. It was the last place on earth where you could buy a cold drink, sleep in a bed, or mail a letter. For Percy Fawcett, Cuiabá was not a destination. It was a prison he had to escape. He spent weeks there, finalizing the supplies, pacing the floorboards of his temporary lodging like a caged tiger. He bought mules, tough, stubborn animals that could survive the rough terrain better than horses. He hired 2 local peons, simple laborers named Simão and Gardulo, who would help manage the animals for the first leg of the journey before being sent back. He was anxious. He checked the harnesses. He checked the guns. He checked the weather. He was like a racehorse trapped in the starting gate, foaming at the mouth to run. But even here, in the safety of the town, the omen of disaster appeared. While they were testing their weapons, Raleigh Rumel, the young friend who had come along for the adventure, suffered a small accident. It seemed trivial at the time. He was bitten by a tick on one of his feet. In England, a tick bite is a nuisance. In the Mato Grosso, it is a roll of the dice with death. Raleigh scratched the bite. The humidity and the bacteria on his skin did the rest. Within days, his foot began to swell. It turned angry and red, then purple. One of his legs began to puff up, making it painful to walk. Fawcett looked at the injury with a mixture of concern and irritation. To him, physical frailty was a sign of mental weakness. He had spent a lifetime ignoring pain, and he expected his subordinates to do the same. He told Raleigh to toughen up, to walk it off, but the infection was deep. Before they had even taken a single step into the unknown, 1/3 of the expedition was already crippled. On April 20th, 1925, they left Cuyaba. They did not march into the deep jungle immediately. The geography of the Mato Grosso is deceptive. Before you reach the rainforest, you have to cross the Cerrado, a massive, dry savanna of twisted trees, termite mounds, and high grass. It is a landscape that looks like the African plains, baking under a relentless sun. The procession was small. Fawcett rode at the front, his eyes scanning the horizon, his compass in his pocket. Jack rode behind him, tall and silent, trying to absorb his father's confidence. Raleigh brought up the rear, wincing with every step the mule took, his swollen foot throbbing in the heat. Behind them walked the 2 peons and the pack animals, their bells jingling in the silence. For the first few weeks, they moved from outpost to outpost, staying at small cattle ranches and sugarcane plantations. These were the fag ends of civilization, lonely, isolated shacks inhabited by rough men who lived on the edge of the wild. At every stop, the locals looked at the 3 Englishmen with a mixture of awe and pity. They saw the blue eyes, the fair skin, the determined jaws. And then they looked at the map Fawcett was carrying, pointing toward the north, toward the river of death and the territory of the hostile tribes. The locals shook their heads. They told stories of the Morcegos, the bat people who lived in caves and hunted at night. They told stories of the Cinta Larga, the tribe with the long belts who crushed the skulls of intruders. Fawcett listened to these stories politely, but he didn't believe them, or rather, he didn't care. He believed that his spiritual armor would protect him. He believed that if he approached the tribes with peace and confidence, they would recognize his superiority and let him pass. It was a colonial arrogance that borders on the suicidal. By May, the expedition reached the outpost of Bacairi. This was a settlement of tame Indians who had been contacted by the Brazilian government. It was here that the last photographs of the expedition were taken. If you look at those grainy black and white photos today, they are haunting. You see Percy Fawcett, looking thin but wiry, his hands on his hips, staring down the camera with a defiance that chills the blood. You see Jack, shirtless, looking like a Greek god, smiling with the innocence of youth. And you see Raleigh. In the photos, Raleigh looks different. He looks haunted. His eyes are sunken. He is not smiling. He is a young man who has realized that he has made a terrible mistake, but he is too far from home to turn back. At Bacairi, Fawcett made a decision that sealed Raleigh's fate. The boy was clearly sick. His foot was not healing. The infection was poisoning his blood. A rational leader would have sent Raleigh back to Cuyaba with the peons. It would have been a disappointment, yes, but it would have saved his life. But Fawcett did not send him back. Why? Perhaps he couldn't spare the supplies for a return trip. Perhaps he didn't want the embarrassment of a team member quitting. Or perhaps, in his mystical worldview, he believed that the journey itself would heal Raleigh, that the closer they got to the high vibrations of the lost city, the stronger they would become. He kept Raleigh, and they marched on. On May 20th, they reached the site that Fawcett had named on his previous disastrous trip, Dead Horse Camp. The name itself was a gravestone. It was the place where his horse had died of starvation 5 years earlier. The bones were likely still there, bleached white by the sun and scattered by scavengers. It was a desolate, lonely spot in the middle of nowhere. Reaching Dead Horse Camp was a victory for Fawcett, but it was the end of the line for the peons. This was the agreed-upon separation point. The 2 Brazilian labourers, Simão and Gardulo, would go no further. They were terrified of what lay ahead. They could smell the danger in the air. This brings us to the most critical moment of the entire saga, the final dispatch. On May 29th, 1925, Percy Fawcett sat down at a folding table in the middle of the wilderness. He took out a piece of paper and a pen. The sun was beating down. The insects were buzzing around his head. He wrote a letter to his wife, Nina, back in England. This letter is one of the most famous documents in the history of exploration. It is the last voice we ever heard from him. He wrote about the difficulties of the journey. He wrote about the pium flies that were driving them mad with their biting. He wrote about the heat, but he also wrote with a strange, eerie calm. He described Jack as being fit and well, and he glossed over Raleigh's condition, saying he was getting better, which was almost certainly a lie to protect Raleigh's family from worry. But the final lines of the letter are the ones that echo through history. He wrote, "You need have no fear of any failure." Think about that sentence. He is standing on the edge of a map that has "unexplored" written across it in blood. He is dragging a crippled boy and his own son into a jungle filled with hostile tribes, starvation, and disease. And he tells his wife, "You need have no fear of failure." Was it hubris? Was it madness? Or was it a man trying to comfort the woman he loved, knowing deep down that he might never see her again? He handed the letter to the peons. He also gave them letters from Jack and Raleigh. Jack's letter was optimistic, full of boyish excitement about the muscles he was building and the sights he was seeing. Raleigh didn't write a letter, or if he did, it didn't survive. He was likely too sick or too depressed to put pen to paper. The morning of the departure was quiet. The air in the Cerrado is still at dawn, before the heat rises. The sky would have been a pale, washed-out blue. Fawcett, Jack, and Raleigh stood on one side of the camp. The two Brazilian peons stood on the other. They divided the gear. The peons would take the mules back. The three explorers would continue on foot. This is the moment the Rubicon was crossed. Fawcett was shedding the last skin of civilization. He was giving up his transport. He was giving up his connection to the world. He was giving up his lifeline. Fawcett strapped on his pack. It weighed roughly 40 pounds. Jack did the same. Raleigh, limping, pulled his pack onto his shoulders, wincing at the weight. They turned their backs on the south. They turned their faces toward the north. The terrain ahead was a wall of green scrub that thickened into the dense, towering canopy of the Amazon basin. There were no paths. Fawcett had his machete in his hand. He took a swing at a vine, stepped over a fallen log, and began to walk. The peons watched them go. They watched the three figures get smaller and smaller in the distance. They saw the glint of the sun on the barrel of Jack's rifle. They saw the stoop in Raleigh's shoulders. They saw the relentless marching rhythm of the colonel. They watched until the three men were just specks against the tree line. And then they watched as the specks merged with the shadows. The green curtain swallowed them. The peons waited for a moment, perhaps expecting them to turn back, perhaps expecting a wave. But there was no wave. There was no looking back. Percy Fawcett did not look back. He was walking towards Z. The peons turned their mules around and began the long trek back to Cuiabá. They carried the letters that would become holy relics. They carried the news that the crazy Englishman had finally done it. Behind them, the jungle closed up like a wound healing over. The silence returned. The birds resumed their calls. The insects resumed their drone. Percy Fawcett, Jack Fawcett, and Raleigh Rimmel had stepped out of history and into myth. At that moment, on May 29th, 1925, they were alive. They had food in their packs. They had bullets in their guns. They had hope in their hearts. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and the months turned into a year, the silence grew deafening. There were no more letters. There were no telegraphs. There were no sightings. The world waited. Nina Fawcett sat by her window in England, waiting for the postman. The editors at the newspapers waited for the next scoop. The Royal Geographical Society waited for the coordinates of the lost city. They waited, and the silence stretched on. It stretched for 2 years, and then the rumors began. Because in the Amazon, nothing truly disappears. Everything leaves a trace, a buckle, a ring, a story told around a campfire by a tribe that had never seen a white man before. The men were gone, but the mystery was just being born. The Rubicon had been crossed, but the war for the truth was just beginning. What happened in the days after they walked into the trees? Did they find the city? Did they find gold? Or did they find something else? To answer that, we have to follow the trail of those who went looking for them. We have to look at the clues they left behind like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale. And the first clue, was a rumor of a white man living as a king among the savages. The Golden Ghost had been born. Chapter 7. The First Search. The jungle does not give up its dead easily, but before it gives up the dead, it gives up the silence. After Percy Fawcett, Jack and Raleigh walked into the trees on May 28, 1925, the world held its breath. Fawcett had told everyone that he would be gone for a year, perhaps 2. He had warned his wife, Nina, not to send a rescue party if he didn't return immediately. He had said, "If we do not come out, it is because we are dead, and I do not want anyone else to die looking for my bones." But human nature does not tolerate a void. The year 1925 passed, then 1926. The silence from the Mato Grosso was total. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. In London, the Royal Geographical Society maintained a stiff upper lip, publicly stating that the colonel was a man of immense resourcefulness, who was likely just detained by the rainy season or a lack of guides. They projected confidence, but in private, in the hushed corridors of the club, the whispers had already started. "He's gone." The old fool finally did it. He walked off the edge. The newspapers, however, were not so patient. The North American Newspaper Alliance had paid for a story, and they were getting nothing but static. By 1927, the headlines shifted from Fawcett explores unknown to Fawcett missing, and finally to Fawcett dead. But there was one person who refused to wear black, Nina Fawcett. Sitting in her home in England, facing the grey Atlantic, she became a figure of tragic resolve. She did not believe her husband was dead. She knew he wasn't. Her belief wasn't based on logic or maps. It was based on the mystical connection she shared with Percy. They were both theosophists, believers in telepathy and spiritual planes. She consulted mediums. She consulted psychics. She claimed she was receiving messages from Percy through the ether. He was alive. He was trapped. He was living in a cave. He had lost his memory. The stories changed, but the conviction remained ironclad. She became the anchor that kept the story from drifting away. Her refusal to accept his death shamed the world into action. The pressure became too great to ignore. If the greatest explorer of his generation was rotting in a jungle prison, someone had to go get him. Enter Commander George Dyett. George Dyett was the anti-Fawcett. He was a fellow member of the Royal Geographical Society, yes, and he was a capable explorer, but he was a man of the 20th century. While Fawcett was a mystic who despised technology, Dyett was a pragmatist. He was media savvy. He was skeptical. He didn't believe in Atlantean cities or white Indians. He believed in logistics. In 1928, 3 years after Fawcett vanished, Dyett announced that he would lead a relief expedition. But he was careful with his words. He didn't promise to bring Fawcett back alive. He promised to solve the riddle. He was going into the Green Hell not as a savior, but as a detective. The Dyett expedition was a spectacle. It was heavily funded, well equipped, and followed by the world press. Dyett took radios. He took cameras. He took gifts for the tribes. He intended to retrace Fawcett's steps to Dead Horse Camp, and then follow the trail of crumbs into the unknown. The journey to the camp was eerie. Walking in the footsteps of a dead man is a haunting experience. Dyett found the trail to be difficult but navigable. He reached the spot where Fawcett had sent the peons back. The site was overgrown, the jungle already reclaiming the clearing. But the ghosts were there. Dyett began to push north into the territory of the Kalapalo Indians. This was the zone of silence that Fawcett had entered. The encounter with the Kalapalos was the turning point of the entire mystery. The Kalapalos were a river tribe. They were tall, muscular, and at that time relatively uncontacted. They lived in large communal huts near the Kulueni River. When Dyett arrived, he didn't come in with guns blazing. He came in with trade goods, knives, beads, mirrors. He wanted to talk. Through a series of translators and sign language, Dyett began to ask the question that had brought him thousands of miles. "Have you seen the white men?" The reaction of the tribe was guarded. In the Amazon, information is currency, and admitting you know about a missing white man is dangerous. It brings soldiers. It brings trouble. But slowly, the story began to leak out. An elder named Aloik stepped forward. He was a man of authority, with piercing eyes, and a chest painted with Urukum dye. He told Diot a story that sounded terrifyingly plausible. Aloik claimed that yes, 3 white men had passed through their village many moons ago. One was an older man, the chief. 2 were younger. One of the younger men was limping, Raleigh. The tribe remembered them well because the old man, Fawcett, had been difficult. This was the first crack in the saintly image of Percy Fawcett. The Kalapalos didn't describe a friendly, enlightened explorer. They described a man who was impatient, rude, and aggressive. Aloik said that the white chief had refused to share his food. He had refused to give gifts. When the tribe offered them a duck to eat, the white man had thrown it down. This behavior is shocking to us, but it fits with the psychological profile of Fawcett in his final days. He was starving. He was obsessed. He was paranoid. He viewed the natives as obstacles, not friends. He was hoarding his supplies for the city's Z, not realizing that generosity was the tax you paid for safe passage in the jungle. Aloik told Diot that the 3 men had stayed for a short time and then insisted on continuing east into the territory of the fierce Indians, likely the Suya or the Zavante. The Kalapalos had warned him. They had pointed to the smoke rising in the distance and said, "Bad people live there. They will kill you." But Fawcett, with his supreme confidence, had ignored them. He took his son and the limping boy and walked away. Aloik said that for 5 days they could see the smoke from the white men's campfire rising above the trees, and on the 6th day the smoke stopped. It was a chilling detail. The smoke stopped, but Diot wasn't satisfied with just a story. He needed proof, physical proof, and he found it. In the village of the Kalapalos, hanging in the dim light of a hut, Diot saw something that made his blood run cold. It was a metal trunk, an airtight military-style trunk. He examined it. It was English. It belonged to the expedition. How did the tribe get it? Aloik's story shifted. He claimed that the white chief had given it to them as a gift before he left. Diot didn't buy it. Fawcett was a man who counted every ounce of equipment. He was a man who refused to give a single knife to a guide. Would he really have given away a valuable airtight trunk to a tribe he had been rude to? It didn't make sense. Then, the children of the village were seen playing with something else, a brass collar. It was a piece of a scientific instrument, a theodolite or a compass case. The evidence was mounting. The Kalapalos had the white men's gear. Diot began to press harder. The atmosphere in the village changed. The smiles disappeared. The women and children began to retreat into the huts. The warriors began to sharpen their arrows. The hospitality was evaporating. Diot, unlike Fawcett, was a man who knew when the wind was changing. He realized that he was outnumbered, hundreds of miles from help, accusing a warrior tribe of murder. He was standing in the middle of a crime scene, and the murderers were holding the spears. One night, Aloik came to Diot's tent. The conversation was tense. Aloik told Diot that if he went any further east, into the bad territory, he would die too. It was a threat thinly veiled as advice. Diot also claimed to have found something else, a specific direction. He said that Aloik eventually confessed that the 3 white men had been followed. He said that a group of Kalapalos, or perhaps a neighboring tribe that the Kalapalos were allied with, had tracked the Englishmen. They had waited until they were camped near a lagoon, and there they had clubbed them to death. Why? Because Fawcett had slapped a tribal member, or because they wanted the guns, or simply because the white men were weak, rude, and trespassing. The motive was murky, but the result was final. Diot was convinced. He believed he had solved the puzzle. The city of Z was a fantasy. The reality was a sordid, violent end in a muddy clearing. But then, the situation turned critical. Diot's own supplies were running low. He began to overhear the warriors discussing an attack on his own party. They were debating whether to let Diot leave with this knowledge. If he went back and told the big white chief in Rio that the Kalapalos were killers, the army would come. The only way to keep the secret was to silence the detective. Diot staged a masterclass in escape. He kept up the appearance of friendship during the day, but at night he prepared to run. He ordered his men to quietly pack the canoes. They abandoned the heavy gear, the tents, the scientific equipment to move faster. Under the cover of darkness, just like in a movie, the Diot expedition slipped into the river. They paddled silently for hours, terrified that at any moment the water would erupt with war canoes chasing them. They didn't stop until they were miles downstream, back in the safety of the main river channel. When Diot returned to civilization in late 1928, he held a press conference. He was exhausted, thin, and shaken. He told the world, "Fawcett is dead." He presented his theory. The 3 men were killed by the Indians roughly 5 days after leaving Dead Horse Camp. It was a failure of diplomacy, not a mystical disappearance. It was a tragedy of manners. The press ran the story. Fawcett massacre confirmed. Nina Fawcett read the reports. She saw the logic. She heard about the trunk. But then she asked the question that would haunt the next century. Where are the bodies? Diot had no bodies. He had no bones. He had no photographs of the grave. He only had the word of a chief who had a vested interest in lying, and a metal trunk that could have been found, stolen, or traded. Nina refused to accept it. To her, a trunk didn't prove death. It proved they were there. Maybe they abandoned the trunk because it was too heavy. Maybe they traded it for food. Diot's certainty began to crumble under scrutiny. Other explorers pointed out holes in his story. If the Indians killed them, where were the guns? Where were the skulls? In Amazonian warfare, trophies are kept. Why was there nothing else? The Diot expedition had done something dangerous. It had provided an answer, but not the answer. It had pricked the balloon of hope, but it hadn't popped it. Instead of closing the book on Percy Fawcett, George Diot had inadvertently started a new chapter. He had confirmed that the tribes knew something. He had confirmed that the route was correct. And most importantly, he had brought back the coordinates of the last known location. This didn't stop the treasure hunters. It encouraged them. Now they knew where to look. They knew where the X was on the map. The legend of the White King began to mutate. If Fawcett wasn't dead, perhaps he was being held prisoner. Perhaps the Kalapalos were lying to protect him. Perhaps he had found the city and shut the gates. The 1930s were approaching. The world was darkening toward another world war. But in the jungles of Brazil, the lights were just beginning to flicker in the darkness. Men with guns, men with maps, and men with delusions were packing their bags. Diot was the first. He would not be the last. The jungle had tasted blood, and it was waiting for more. The mystery of the bones was about to begin. Chapter 8. The Cult of the White King. The jungle had swallowed the men, but it could not swallow the legend. In fact, the silence of the Amazon acted like an incubator. In the years following George Diot's 1928 declaration that Fawcett was dead, a strange psychological phenomenon swept across the world. The public simply refused to accept the ending. It was too grim. It was too ordinary. The 1930s were a difficult time. The Great Depression was crushing the global economy. The shadow of fascism was rising in Europe. People were desperate for escapism. They didn't want to hear about a colonel clubbed to death in a muddy swamp. They wanted a hero who had escaped the broken world. They wanted to believe that somewhere, in the green, uncharted heart of the planet, a man had found paradise. And so, the cult of the White King was born. Between 1928 and 1935, the newspapers were flooded with sightings. It became the Elvis Presley phenomenon of its day. Every rubber tapper, every missionary, and every lost prospector who emerged from the Mato Grosso had a story to sell. They had seen a white man. They had seen a giant with blue eyes. They had seen a bearded figure dressed in animal skins, commanding a tribe of Indians. Most of these were lies, concocted for a few dollars or a free drink in a Riverport bar. But in 1932, one story emerged that was so specific, so detailed, and so chilling that it reignited the entire search. It came from a Swiss trapper named Stefan Ratin. Ratin was not a glory seeker. He was a rough, illiterate bushman who had spent years living in the deep interior, trading jaguar skins. In 1932, he walked into the British consulate in Sao Paulo with a story that made the diplomats spill their tea. He claimed that months earlier he had been traveling in a remote region northwest of the River of Death, far from any known settlement. He had stumbled upon a village of indigenous people who were holding a prisoner. Rattin described the prisoner in meticulous detail. He was an old man with long white hair and a white beard that reached his chest. He was dressed in skins. He looked ragged, broken, and desperate. When the old man saw Rattin, a white face in a sea of brown, he didn't scream. He simply walked over. Rattin said the man spoke to him in English. Rattin, being Swiss, spoke poor English, but he understood the basics. The old man asked, "Are you English?" Rattin said no. The old man's face fell. He then began to cry. He pointed to the east and said, "I am a colonel. I am English. I have been held here for many years. My son is dead. My friend is dead. I am alone." The old man then did something remarkable. He showed Rattin a signet ring on his finger. He said, "Go to the British consul. Tell them you saw me. Tell Major Paget I am alive." Major Paget was a real person, a friend of Fawcett's. It was a detail a random Swiss trapper should not have known. Rattin tried to get the man to leave, but the tribe surrounded them. They were hostile. They wouldn't let the white chief go. Rattin, fearing for his own life, had to leave. He promised to return with help. As he paddled away, he looked back and saw the old man standing on the riverbank weeping. The story hit the world like a bomb. The colonel is alive. Nina Fawcett, in England, was electrified. This matched everything her psychics had told her. Her husband was a captive. He was suffering. He was waiting for her. The description matched Percy perfectly. The location made sense. The mention of Major Paget was the smoking gun. The reaction was immediate. Stefan Rattin became an overnight celebrity. He was a hero. He announced that he would lead a rescue mission to go back and get the colonel. He raised money. He gathered a small team. He didn't wait for the Royal Geographical Society to debate the logistics. He was a man of action. Later in 1932, Stefan Rattin and two companions loaded their canoes and headed back up the river. They were going to the specific coordinates where he had seen the White King. The world waited for the telegram that would say, "Found him." They waited, and they waited. Stefan Rattin never came back. He vanished, just like Fawcett. Did he find the tribe? Did he find the old man? Or did he walk into a trap? Some skeptics later argued that Rattin was a con artist who invented the story to get funding, and then simply took the money and disappeared into Brazil to start a new life. Others believed he was telling the truth, and the tribe that held Fawcett killed the rescuer to keep their prize. The jungle had claimed the searcher, but the Rattin incident opened the floodgates. It proved to the believers that the jungle was hiding something massive. The 1930s saw a parade of eccentrics entering the Amazon. It became a graveyard for the romantic and the delusional. There was the case of Albert de Winton. De Winton was not an explorer. He was an actor, a Shakespearean actor from London who had become obsessed with the Fawcett story. He decided that the reason previous expeditions failed was that they were armed. He believed that if he went in unarmed, with peace in his heart, the tribes would welcome him. It was a beautiful, naive thought. De Winton travelled to the Mato Grosso in 1934. He planned to walk into the Kalapalo villages alone. He wanted to use his acting skills to communicate, to mime friendship. He brought gifts. He brought a dove of peace. He was last seen paddling a canoe toward the tribal lands, dressed in his safari gear, looking like he was stepping onto a stage. Months later, reports trickled back. The Kalapalos had found him. They didn't understand his acting. They didn't understand his lack of weapons. To them, a man without a gun is not a friend. He is prey. Or perhaps they thought he was a spirit. They clubbed him to death. His body was never found. He was just another ghost in the green room. Then there was the journalistic phase. a young Peter Fleming, the brother of Ian Fleming, the man who would create James Bond, joined an expedition in 1932. This expedition was less about finding Fawcett and more about the absurdity of the search. Fleming wrote a book called Brazilian Adventure. It was a comedy. He mocked the incompetence of the searchers, the bugs, the heat, and the endless rumours. Fleming's book changed the tone. He was the first to suggest that maybe there was no great mystery. Maybe it was just a bungled camping trip. He found no city. He found no white king. He found only silence and insects. He returned home and said, essentially, forget it. It's a green hell, and there is nothing there. But Nina Fawcett would not forget it. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, Nina became a tragic figure. She lived on a meagre pension, spending her money on spiritualists. She sat in darkened rooms in London, holding hands with mediums who claimed to be channeling Percy. The messages were always the same. I am alive. I am working. The city is real. The boys are with me. Nina began to propagate the White Brotherhood theory. She believed that Percy hadn't just found a ruin, he had found a living society of master souls. She believed he was being initiated into their order. He wasn't missing, he had ascended. This belief shielded her from the horror of the truth. It was better to believe her husband was a spectral wizard than to believe he was a skeleton in the mud. But while Nina was looking at the stars, the reality on the ground in Brazil was getting darker. The constant stream of white intruders, journalists, gold diggers, rescuers, had agitated the tribes. The Kalapalos, the Savante, and the Kayapo were becoming militant. They were tired of being asked about the white man. They were tired of the accusations. The zone of silence became a war zone. The Brazilian government began to restrict access. They required permits. They declared the area off limits to amateurs. They were trying to stop the suicide run. By the late 1940s, the world had changed. World War II had ravaged the globe. The age of the Victorian explorer was officially dead. Satellites were being dreamed of. The map was being filled in by airplanes. But in 1947, a final strange twist occurred in the rumor era. A Brazilian official named Orlando Vilas Boas, one of the legendary Vilas Boas brothers, the greatest activists for indigenous rights in Brazilian history, began to work in the Xingu region. The Vilas Boas brothers were not treasure hunters. They were humanitarians. They lived with the tribes. They learned the languages. They gained the trust that Fawcett and Diot never had. Orlando Vilas Boas began to hear stories from the Kalapalos, real stories, not myths about white kings, but specific grounded memories from the elders. They told him about the Kariba, the bad white man. They told him about the tall one and the limping one. And they told him something else. They told him that the bones were not lost. They told him that they knew exactly where the bodies were buried. The era of the White King was ending. The era of the bones was about to begin. The fantasy that Percy Fawcett was ruling a hidden civilization was about to collide with the forensic reality of a shallow grave. But the rumors had done their work. They had kept the name alive for 20 years. They had turned a failed surveyor into a demigod. They had created a mystery so potent that even the discovery of a skull would not be enough to kill it. As the 1950s dawned, Orlando Vilas Boas prepared to sit down with the Kalapalo chief and ask the question that had killed so many men before him. Who killed Percy Fawcett? And for the first time, he would get an answer. Chapter 9. The Confession. The year was 1951. The world had changed. The Jazz Age was a memory. The Second World War was over, and the map of the world was being redrawn. But in the upper Xingu, time had stood still. The mystery of Percy Fawcett was no longer a headline. It was a scar on the landscape. The rumors of white gods and golden cities had faded into the background, replaced by a cold, hard silence. But the silence was about to be broken, not by a treasure hunter, not by a psychic, and not by a soldier. It was broken by a humanitarian. Enter Orlando Vilas Boas. If Percy Fawcett was the villain of this story, the arrogant intruder who marched into the wild demanding glory, Orlando Vilas Boas was the hero. Along with his brothers, Claudio and Leonardo, Orlando was not in the Amazon to conquer it. He was there to protect it. The Villas-Boas brothers were the architects of the Xingu National Park, a massive reservation designed to shield the indigenous tribes from the encroaching modern world. They didn't carry guns to intimidate. They didn't carry maps to steal land. They lived with the tribes. They learned the languages. They ate the food. They sat by the fires for years, listening. They earned a currency that Fawcett never had: trust. By the late 1940s, Orlando had become a father figure to the tribes of the region, including the Kalapalo, the last people to see Fawcett alive. Orlando knew the rumors. He knew the stories of the White Chief, but he never pressed. He waited. He knew that in the Xingu, the truth is not hunted, it is given. The breakthrough happened slowly. It started with small inconsistencies. Orlando noticed that the Kalapalo possessed items that shouldn't have been there. A rusty knife with a Sheffield steel hallmark. A certain way, the elders spoke about the year of the starving white men. In early 1951, Orlando sat down with the Kalapalo chief, a man named Sarari. The relationship between the two men was one of mutual respect. Orlando told Sarari that the white tribe in the cities was still asking about the lost colonel. He told him that the government would not punish the tribe. He promised that if they told the truth, the matter would be closed forever. He offered them amnesty. Sarari looked at Orlando. He looked at his people. And finally, the burden became too heavy to carry. "We killed them," Sarari said. It was the sentence the world had waited 26 years to hear. The story that poured out of the chief was not a tale of magic or lost cities. It was a tragic, gritty story of a cultural collision. It stripped away the romance of the Fawcett legend and revealed the ugly truth of his final days. Sarari explained that the three white men, the old one, Fawcett, the young one, Jack, and the limping one, Raleigh, had arrived at the village exhausted and desperate. But they were not humble. Fawcett, according to the tribe, had been aggressive. He was starving, yet he refused to trade his equipment for food. He treated the Kalapalo children with disdain. The breaking point, according to oral history, came when a child touched Fawcett's pack. The colonel, stressed and paranoid, slapped the child away. In the culture of the Xingu, to strike a child is a grave offense. But even then, the tribe did not attack immediately. They watched. The three men left the village, marching east toward the River of Death. But they didn't go far. Fawcett made camp near a lagoon. The smoke from their fire was visible to the village. Sarari explained that the elders held a council. They decided that these white men were dangerous. They were not guests. They were invaders who showed no respect. They were Kariba, bad spirits. If they were allowed to continue, they might bring more white men. They might bring sickness. The decision was made. The warriors waited until the morning. They followed the trail. They found the three men at their camp. Fawcett was sitting by the fire. The attack was swift. There was no epic battle. There were no last words. It was a tactical removal of a threat. The warriors used clubs. It was over in seconds. The tribe then disposed of the bodies. They buried the two young men in shallow graves near the river, but the old one, the chief, was treated differently. Because he was a man of power, despite his rudeness, they buried him separately, near the lagoon, to keep his spirit from wandering. After Sarari finished the story, silence filled the hut. The mystery was solved. There was no city of Z. There was no White King. There was only a failure of diplomacy and a shallow grave. But Orlando needed more than a story. He needed the bones. He asked Sarari if he could show him the grave. The chief was reluctant. Disturbing the dead is a taboo. But Orlando insisted, arguing that taking the bones back to the white tribe would finally stop the explorers from coming. It would bring peace to the Kalapalo. Sarari agreed. In April 1951, a strange procession walked to the edge of the Lagoon of the Dead. The heat was stifling. The insects were swarming. Orlando Villas-Boas stood with his camera, documenting the moment. The Kalapalo warriors began to dig. The earth was hard and dry. They dug for hours, and then the shovel hit something. Orlando leaned in. In the red dust of the Mato Grosso, a skull emerged. It was yellowed with age, but it was unmistakably human. They uncovered the rest of the skeleton. It was curled up, the knees drawn to the chest, in the traditional burial manner of the region, but the tribe insisted this was the white man. Orlando felt a chill. He was looking at the face of the legend. He was looking at the man who had inspired a generation of dreamers. The man who had walked off the map was now lying at his feet, reduced to calcium and dust. The discovery sent a shockwave around the world. "Fawcett found," screamed the headlines in London, New York, and Rio. Orlando Villas-Boas emerged from the jungle carrying a box containing the bones. He was greeted like a conquering hero. The media circus was insane. Photographers pushed and shoved to get a picture of the bones of the century. The bones were flown to Rio de Janeiro. They were placed on a velvet table at the Scientific Institute. The experts gathered. They measured the femur. They measured the jaw. They looked at the teeth. Nina Fawcett, now an old woman living in Switzerland, received the news. She was heartbroken, but she was also skeptical. She asked the question that would turn the triumph into a controversy. Does the jaw have the bridge work? Percy Fawcett had a very specific dental record. He wore a bridge on his upper teeth. The scientists in Rio looked at the skull. They looked at the dental records sent from London. There was a pause. The teeth didn't match. And then they looked at the height. The skeleton belonged to a man of average height. Percy Fawcett was over 6 feet tall. Doubt began to creep into the room. Orlando Villas-Boas was furious. He knew the Kalapalo. He knew they hadn't lied about the murder. Why would they lie about the bones? He went back to the tribe. He pressed them. Are these the real bones? The Kalapalo admitted that yes, they had killed the men, but they had thrown the bodies of the 2 young men into the river where the piranhas and the current had taken them. The old one, they said, was buried where they showed him. So why the discrepancy? 2 theories emerged. Theory 1. The jungle soil changes bones. Compression and erosion can shrink a skeleton. Teeth can be lost. The scientists in Rio were working with damaged goods. Theory 2. The Kalapalo played one final trick. They wanted the white men to stop bothering them. They wanted Orlando to stop asking. So they dug up the bones of one of their own ancestors, or perhaps another unfortunate traveller, and gave them to Orlando. They gave the white world what it wanted, a body, but they kept the spirit of the colonel for themselves. The confession of 1951 was supposed to be the period at the end of the sentence. Instead, it became a question mark. Orlando Villas-Boas had solved the crime, but he had lost the evidence. The bones remained in a limbo of scientific debate for years. Were they Fawcett? Were they a native? Were they a hoax? But the story of the confession did something more important than providing forensic proof. It changed the narrative of Percy Fawcett forever. For decades, Fawcett had been the hero, the brave explorer marching into the darkness. The Kalapalo confession flipped the script. It painted a picture of a man unraveling. It showed us the dark side of obsession. It showed us that the green hell wasn't just the environment, it was the man himself. Fawcett hadn't been killed by savages because they were evil. He had been killed because he had forgotten his humanity. He had let his dream consume his compassion. As the box of disputed bones sat in a laboratory in Rio, gathering dust, the spirit of Percy Fawcett was still out there. The Kalapalo knew it. They knew that you can bury a body, but you cannot bury a ghost. The investigation was technically over, but the mystery refused to die, and soon a new generation of adventurers would look at those mismatched dental records and say, if those aren't his bones, then he might still be there. The 1950s ended in confusion, but the final chapter of the saga was yet to be written. The bones would tell one story, but the ring, the signet ring, would tell another. Chapter 10. The Invisible City. The bones found by Orlando Villas-Boas in 1951 ended up being a scientific dead end. After years of debate, testing, and counter-testing, the consensus solidified. The skeleton in the box was not Percy Fawcett. It was too short. The teeth were wrong. The bones of the century were quietly returned to the anonymity of history. But while the search for Fawcett's body had hit a wall, the search for his dream was about to have a breakthrough. For decades, the academic world had laughed at Percy Fawcett. They called him a romantic fool. They called him a crank. The established scientific dogma of the 20th century was clear. The Amazon was a counterfeit paradise. It was a green desert. The soil was too acidic and too poor to support large-scale agriculture. Therefore, it was impossible for a complex civilization to exist there. The tribes, they argued, had always been small, nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers. Fawcett's talk of large cities, roads, and populations in the millions was dismissed as the fever dream of a man who had read too many adventure novels. Fawcett died trying to prove them wrong, and for 50 years after his death, it looked like the skeptics were right. No stone pyramids were ever found. No gold statues were ever dug up. But then, in the 1990s and early 2000s, a new generation of archaeologists entered the Xingu, the very region where Fawcett vanished. Leading them was an American anthropologist named Michael Heckenberger. Heckenberger wasn't looking for gold. He was looking at the dirt. He began to live with the Kwikuro people, neighbors of the Kalapalo. He noticed something strange about the landscape. The jungle floor wasn't flat. It was bumpy. There were ridges, mounds, and depressions that looked too regular to be natural. He began to map them. He used satellite imagery. He used GPS. And slowly, a ghost city began to emerge from the undergrowth. Heckenberger discovered that the pristine wilderness of the Xingu was actually a massive abandoned garden. He found a network of ancient settlements that stretched for nearly 8,000 square miles. He called it Kuhikugu. It wasn't a city of stone, like the Incas built in Peru. There were no limestone blocks to stack. In the Amazon, stone is rare. So the ancients built with what they had, earth and wood. They were masters of terraforming. They had built massive defensive ditches, moats, that were 10 feet deep and a mile long. They had built wooden palisade walls to protect their towns. They had built raised causeways, wide straight roads made of packed earth, that connected the villages in a precise geometric grid. These roads were oriented to the cardinal directions. Just like Fawcett had claimed, the scale was staggering. This wasn't a collection of huts. It was a grid of garden cities. Heckenberger found evidence of plazas that were hundreds of meters across. He found evidence of managed forests, where the trees were planted specifically for fruit and nuts. He found dams and weirs for fish farming. Most shockingly, he found the soil itself was artificial. It is called terra preta, black earth. It is a nutrient-rich soil created by humans over thousands of years by mixing charcoal, pottery shards, and organic waste into the sterile jungle dirt. This engineered soil allowed them to farm on a massive scale. The population estimates were rewritten overnight. The region that scientists thought could only support a few hundred people had actually been home to a population of 50,000 to 100,000. It was a civilization that rivaled the medieval cities of Europe at the time. And here lies the heartbreaking irony of Percy Fawcett. He was right. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't a liar. He had seen the pottery shards. He had seen the roads. He had heard the legends correctly. There was a massive, complex civilization in the exact location he said there was. But he was blind to it. Fawcett was a Victorian. He was looking for El Dorado. He was looking for European-style ruins. He was looking for stone arches, gold coins, and statues of white kings. He was looking for a civilization that looked like his idea of civilization. He didn't realize that the Amazonian civilization looked different. It was organic. It was biodegradable. It was built of wood that rotted away, and earth that was covered by vines. Fawcett had walked right through the city he was looking for. When he was marching toward Dead Horse Camp, complaining about the jungle, He was likely walking on top of the ancient causeways. When he found pottery shards and dismissed them as primitive, he was holding the remnants of the culture he was dying to find. He was standing in the middle of Z, but he couldn't see it because it didn't glitter. The tragedy of Kuhikugu is that it died just before history could record it. The diseases brought by the first Europeans, smallpox, influenza, measles, swept down the rivers ahead of the explorers. The Great Dying happened in the 1500s and 1600s. The population of the garden cities collapsed. The survivors fled into the forest. The wooden walls rotted. The jungle reclaimed the fields. By the time Fawcett arrived in 1925, the survivors, the Kalapalo, the Kwikuro, were living in the ruins of their ancestors' greatness, telling stories of a time when the villages were huge. Fawcett heard the stories, but he thought they were talking about a lost white race, not their own grandfathers. The discovery of Kuhikugu vindicated Fawcett's intuition, but condemned his methods. He had the right map, but the wrong eyes. This realization changed the tenor of the mystery. It stopped being a story about a madman chasing a myth, and became a story about a visionary who was ahead of his time. Fawcett had predicted that the Amazon was the cradle of civilization. Today, archaeology confirms that the Amazon was a hotbed of cultural innovation, independent of the Andes or Mesoamerica. In the early 2000s, as the satellite maps of the Xingu earthworks were published, the ghost of Percy Fawcett finally got his answer. Z was real. It was just made of dirt, not gold, but even with the city found, the fate of the man remained the final loose thread. The bones were fake. The ring was missing. The White King rumors were debunked. Yet one physical object remained, one tangible piece of evidence that had travelled from the finger of the colonel, through the hands of the tribe, into the pocket of a trader, and finally into a shop window. The compass was gone. The trunk was gone. The bones were gone. But the ring was about to reappear, and this ring, unlike the bones, would tell a story that no one could deny. It would lead the mystery into its final quiet conclusion. The city was invisible, but the legacy was etched in gold. Here is the expanded, deep-dive version of Chapter 11, The Signet Ring. I have significantly expanded the narrative to explore the history of the ring, the conflicting accounts of its discovery, and the profound psychological weight it carried for the family. This version is designed to meet your length requirement and provide the forensic climax of the story. Chapter 11, The Signet Ring. By the late 1970s, the mystery of Percy Fawcett had settled into a kind of mythological stasis. The physical search had exhausted itself. The bones discovered by Orlando Villas-Boas in 1951 had been debunked by science. The rumors of the White King ruling a hidden tribe had faded as the Amazon was slowly mapped by satellites and paved by loggers. The world had moved on. The lost city of Z was increasingly viewed as a campfire story, a tragedy of the Victorian era that had no ending, only a question mark. But the jungle had one last thing to give back. It wasn't a body. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a diary filled with final words. It was a tiny, cold circle of gold. To understand the sheer crushing weight of this object, we first have to understand the man who wore it. Colonel Percy Fawcett was not a man of vanity. He was a man of utility. He wore rough cotton clothes, he used simple guns, and he despised the trappings of high society. But he was also a man of immense pride and deep superstition. On the finger of his left hand, he wore a heavy gold signet ring. This was not a wedding. Banned. It was a piece of history. It was a massive 18-carat gold heirloom that had been in the Fawcett family for generations. It was a symbol of his lineage, his connection to the British establishment that he simultaneously served and despised. But more importantly, it was a talisman. Carved deep into the soft gold of the ring was the family crest, a salamander surrounded by flames. And beneath the image was the family motto, written in Latin, Nec aspera terrent. Translated, it means, difficulties be damned, or adversities do not daunt us. It was the defining slogan of Fawcett's life. It was the phrase he whispered when the rains came down like hammer blows. It was the phrase he shouted when the boat capsized in the rapids. It was the philosophy that drove him to drag his son into the void. Nec aspera terrent. Don't let the hardness of the world stop you. Ignore the pain, ignore the hunger, keep walking. Before he left for the 1925 expedition, Fawcett had made a specific, chilling promise to his wife, Nina, and his son, Brian, who had stayed behind in England. He held up his hand, showed them the heavy gold band, and said, "I will never take this ring off. If it is found, it means I am dead." He meant it as a dramatic vow, a way to assure them of his tenacity. He didn't realize he was giving them the key to solving his own murder. The story of the ring's recovery is as strange, murky, and chaotic as the rest of the saga, but unlike the bones, the ring is an undeniable fact. It exists. You can hold it. The timeline of the ring is a jagged line that cuts through the decades. Reports suggest it resurfaced very early, perhaps as early as 1928, in the immediate chaotic aftermath of the disappearance. But its significance wasn't fully processed by the world until much later. The most accepted and detailed account of its recovery comes from the year 1979, but the events it describes took place decades earlier. It involves a man named Brian Fawcett, Percy's surviving son. Brian had spent his entire adult life living in the shadow of his father's disappearance. He had travelled to Brazil multiple times. He had interviewed the tribes. He had fought to clear his father's name. And then the ring found him. The story goes that the ring was discovered in the most banal, unheroic place imaginable. It wasn't found in a temple. It wasn't found on a skeleton in a cave. It was found in a shop. Specifically, it was found in a venda, a small, dusty general store and trading post in the town of Diamantino. In the 1920s, Diamantino was a rough frontier settlement, a place of red dust, stray dogs, and hard men. It was the last stop before the wilderness, a place where prospectors bought shovels and rubber tappers bought rum. According to the report, the shopkeeper was sweeping out his store. In a pile of refuse, dust, dried mud, dead insects, and trash, something caught the light. He bent down and picked it up. It was a gold ring, battered and scratched, covered in grime. How did it get there? The shopkeeper didn't know, but in the economy of the frontier, items moved fast. A Kalapalo warrior might have traded it to a rubber tapper for a machete. The rubber tapper might have traded it to a prospector for a bottle of cachaça. The prospector might have dropped it in the shop, or pawned it for supplies, unaware of what it was. The ring had passed from hand to hand, moving downstream, devaluing with every transaction, while the man who wore it lay rotting hundreds of miles upstream. The ring eventually made its way into the hands of a British official. When he cleaned the grime off the metal, he saw the salamander, he saw the fire, and he saw the words, "Nec aspera terrent." He knew immediately what he was holding. There was only one man in the Mato Grosso who wore a crest like that. The ring was sent back to England. It arrived in a small box. When the family opened it, the silence must have been deafening. For Nina Fawcett, the ring was a double-edged sword. She had spent decades claiming her husband was alive, living as a mystic chief in a subterranean city. She had built a fortress of belief around herself. But here was his ring, the ring he swore never to remove, the ring that was part of his identity. For the believers, the cultists and occultists who worshipped Fawcett, the ring was proof of life. They spun wild theories. They argued maybe he traded it. They said that perhaps the colonel, starving and desperate, had been forced to barter his most precious possession for a bag of maize or a safe passage. They argued that the ring's presence in a shop proved that he had made contact with civilization, but to the realists, and to his son Brian, the ring was a death certificate. We have to look at the psychological profile of Percy Fawcett. He was a proud, stiff upper lip Victorian officer. He was obsessed with status, lineage, and honour. He was a man who would rather starve than beg, The idea that Colonel Percy Harrison Fawcett would voluntarily slide his family crest off his finger and hand it to a peasant shopkeeper for a bag of rice is unthinkable. It goes against every fibre of his being. He would have died with that ring on. Therefore, the only way that Ring left his finger was if his finger was no longer attached to his body, or perhaps even darker if he was killed, and the tribe stripped the body. The journey of the ring tells a story of pillaging. If the Kalapalo killed the 3 men as they confessed, they would have taken the trophies. In Amazonian tribal culture, the possessions of a defeated enemy are often distributed. The guns, the knives, the clothes, and the jewelry would have been taken. The ring likely spent time in the village. Perhaps a child played with it. Perhaps a warrior wore it. Eventually, it was traded to a passing outsider, a sertanista, or a trapper, who brought it back to the world of commerce. The ring tells us more than just he died. It gives us a clue about the aftermath. It confirms that the expedition didn't just vanish into thin air. It was dismantled. The physical objects of the Fawcett expedition were scattered across the Mato Grosso like leaves in a storm. The compass was seen here. The trunk was seen there. The ring was found here. The bones were a lie. The White King was a myth, but the ring was real. It is a haunting object to behold. You can imagine it on Fawcett's hand as he hacked through the vines, the gold catching the dappled sunlight of the canopy. You can imagine it glinting in the firelight at Dead Horse Camp as he held his pen, writing those final letters to his wife, assuring her that failure was impossible. You can imagine the inscription Nec Aspera Terrent mocking him as the arrows flew or the clubs fell. Difficulties did not daunt him, but in the end, the difficulties killed him. The return of the ring marked the psychological end of the search for the family. Nina died in 1954, still holding on to her beliefs publicly, but the family archives suggest a quiet resignation. Brian Fawcett, who dedicated his life to clearing up the mystery and wrote the definitive book Exploration Fawcett, accepted the ring as the final period at the end of the sentence. The ring closed the circle. It started in England, travelled to the heart of the unknown, survived the murder of its owner, survived the decay of the jungle, passed through the hands of killers and traders, and against all odds, found its way back to the family. But while the ring answered the question of mortality, it didn't answer the question of legacy. Fawcett was dead. His son was dead. The expedition was a failure, or was it? In the final reckoning, we have to look at what Fawcett actually achieved. He sacrificed everything, his life, his son's life, his reputation, for a map that everyone said was wrong. He died a joke in the eyes of the scientific community. But as we sit here today, looking at the satellite maps of the Amazon, looking at the ring in the museum, we have to ask, who won? The jungle killed the man. But the man forced the world to look at the jungle. The ring is not just a memento of death. It is a symbol of the cost of knowledge. It is a reminder that the blank spaces on the map are not filled in with ink. They are filled in with blood. It is a physical testament to the fact that the age of exploration wasn't a romantic adventure movie. It was a grinder. It chewed up men and spat out gold trinkets. There is a strange irony in the fact that the ring survived, while the man did not. Gold is inert. It does not rust. It does not rot. It is indifferent to the heat and the insects. The organic man, the flesh, the bone, the brain that dreamed of lost cities, was erased by the environment. But the symbol of his stubbornness, the gold band that said, "Difficulties be damned," survived perfectly intact. It is almost as if the ring was the only part of him that was hard enough to survive the green hell. As we move to the final chapter of this story, we leave the mud and the blood behind. We look at the long shadow cast by Percy Fawcett. We look at the books, the movies, and the inspiration that sprouted from his grave. We look at how a failure became a legend. He went looking for a city of stone. He ended up building a city of stories. And in the end, stories last longer than stone. The ring sits in a box today. The inscription is still there, crisp and clear. Difficulties be damned. He was right. The difficulties didn't stop him. They just became his tombstone. and the ring is the epitaph that travelled 5,000 miles to be read. Chapter 12. The Legacy of Z. The jungle is a machine of forgetting. It covers stone with moss. It rots wood into soil. It erases trails, swallows bones, and silences screams. By all the laws of nature, the story of Percy Fawcett should have vanished in 1925, consumed by the same green silence that took his life. He was just one of thousands of men who died looking for El Dorado. He should have been a footnote in a dusty academic journal, a cautionary tale about poor logistics, colonial arrogance, and the madness of the heat. But Percy Fawcett refused to die. While his body disintegrated in the acid soil of the upper Xingu, his spirit achieved something that no other explorer of his generation managed to do. It became immortal. As we stand here today, a full century after he cut the rope to civilization at Dead Horse Camp, we are still talking about him. We are still writing best-selling books about him. We are still making Hollywood movies about him. Why? What is it about this stiff, difficult, obsessive Victorian colonel that haunts the modern imagination so intensely? The answer lies in the massive, sprawling legacy he left behind, a legacy that is split into 3 distinct strands: the fiction, the science, and the warning. The fiction, the birth of a pop culture god. Long before he disappeared, Fawcett was already feeding the engine of fiction. He was friends with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. In the early 1900s, Fawcett would stand in lecture halls in London, his eyes burning with fanatical intensity, describing giant anacondas that measured 60 feet long. He described tracks of unknown beasts in the mud. He described plateaus that rose out of the jungle mist like islands in the sky, cut off from the rest of the world. Conan Doyle sat in the front row, mesmerized. He took Fawcett's descriptions of the Ricardo Franco Hills and transmuted them into gold. He wrote The Lost World, the seminal novel about a place in South America where dinosaurs still roamed. Professor Challenger, the booming, aggressive hero of that book, was partly based on Fawcett. When you watch Jurassic Park today, you are watching the ripples of a stone that Fawcett threw into the cultural pond 100 years ago, but the influence didn't stop there. In the 1980s, a filmmaker named George Lucas and a director named Steven Spielberg were looking for a hero. They wanted an archetypal adventurer. They created a man who wore a fedora, a man who carried a revolver, a man who was terrified of snakes but respected the power of the artifacts he hunted, a man who walked the line between archaeology and grave robbing. Indiana Jones is, in many ways, the spiritual ghost of Percy Fawcett. The fictional Jones found the Ark of the Covenant. The real Fawcett died looking for Z. But the DNA is undeniable. Fawcett created the template for the action archaeologist. He made the jungle seem like a puzzle that could be solved by a man with enough grit. And then there is the comic book hero Tintin. In The Broken Ear, Tintin travels to South America to find a lost tribe. The imagery of the green hell, the blowpipes, the hidden idols, it all stems from the dispatches that Fawcett sent back to the newspapers in 1925. Fawcett failed as an explorer, but he succeeded spectacularly as a muse. He enchanted the 20th century. He gave a grey, industrializing world a splash of technicolor danger. 2. The science, the vindication of the madman. For 70 years, the scientific community treated Percy Fawcett as a joke. He was the crazy uncle of exploration. The archaeologists and anthropologists of the mid-20th century were rigid in their dogma. They believed the Amazon was a counterfeit paradise. They argued that the soil was too acidic, the nutrients too scarce, and the environment too hostile to support anything other than small nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers. They laughed at Fawcett's claims of cities, roads, and populations in the millions. They said he was hallucinating. They said he was mistaking natural rock formations for walls. But then, the technology caught up with the dream. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a new generation of archaeologists, led by the American Michael Heckenberger, returned to the Xingu. They didn't bring machetes. They brought ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery. And when they looked at the ground where Fawcett had walked, they gasped. Heckenberger found the Garden Cities. He found a network of ancient settlements called Kuhikugu that stretched for thousands of square miles. He found defensive ditches and moats that were miles long, engineering projects that would have required thousands of laborers. He found raised causeways, roads made of packed earth, that connected the villages in a precise geometric grid, and most importantly, he found the terra preta, the black earth. The ancients hadn't just lived in the jungle, they had terraformed it. They had engineered the soil, mixing charcoal and organic waste to make it fertile enough to feed a massive population. The estimates were rewritten overnight. The region that scientists thought could only support a few hundred people had actually been home to a population of 50,000 to 100,000. It was a civilization that rivaled the medieval cities of Europe at the time. And here lies the heartbreaking, beautiful irony of Percy Fawcett's life. He was right. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't a liar. He had seen the pottery shards. He had seen the roads. He had heard the legends correctly. There was a massive, complex civilization in the exact location he said there was. But he was blind to it. Fawcett was a Victorian. He was looking for El Dorado. He was looking for European-style ruins. He was looking for stone arches, gold coins, and statues of white kings. He was looking for a civilization that looked like his idea of civilization. He didn't realize that the Amazonian civilization looked different. It was organic. It was biodegradable. It was built of wood that rotted away, and earth that was covered by vines. Fawcett had walked right through the city he was looking for. When he was marching toward Dead Horse Camp, complaining about the jungle, he was literally walking on top of the ancient causeways. When he found pottery shards and dismissed them as primitive, he was holding the remnants of the culture he was dying to find. He was standing in the middle of his Z, but he couldn't see it because it didn't glitter. The discovery of Kuhikugu vindicated Fawcett's intuition, but condemned his methods. He had the right map, but the wrong eyes. But in the end, history has been kind to him. He is no longer viewed as a crank. He is viewed as a visionary who sensed the truth before the science existed to prove it. 3. The warning, the end of the unknown. Finally, there is the darker legacy, the legacy of the map itself. When Fawcett entered the Amazon, it was a blank space. It was labeled Terra Incognita. It was the last great mystery on the surface of the Earth. Today, that mystery is gone. We have satellites that can read a license plate from space. We have GPS on our phones. There are no more blank spots. The Amazon is no longer a green hell that swallows men. It is a fragile ecosystem that is being swallowed by men. The forests that Fawcett hacked through are burning. The lands of the Kalapalo and the Kuikuro are surrounded by soy farms and cattle ranches. The lost city is no longer hidden by vines. It is in danger of being bulldozed by tractors. Fawcett's story triggers a deep, aching nostalgia in us. We miss the unknown. We miss the idea that the world is bigger than we are. We miss the possibility that there are still monsters and magic hidden just over the horizon. We obsess over Fawcett because he represents the last moment in human history when we could still get truly, hopelessly lost. He represents the era before the world became small, mapped, and safe, the final fade-out. So, how do we leave him? We don't leave him with the forensic evidence of the ring. We don't leave him with the satellite maps of the earthworks. We leave him where he belongs, in the myth. Close your eyes, and picture the scene one last time. It is May 29th, 1925. The sun is rising over the Cerrado. The air is cool. The sky is a pale, infinite blue. 3 men stand at the edge of the trees. There is the colonel, Percy Fawcett. He is 57 years old, lean, weathered, his eyes fixed on the northern horizon. He adjusts the straps of his pack. He checks his compass. He is not afraid. He is exactly where he wants to be. He believes he is walking toward destiny. There is Jack Fawcett, 21 years old. Tall, strong, beautiful. He is holding his rifle. He looks at his father with absolute trust. He doesn't know that he will never kiss a girl, never grow old, never see England again. He is innocent. And there is Raleigh Rimmel, 22 years old. He is limping. His foot is swollen. He is in pain. He looks back at the peons, back at the mules, back at the safety of the world he is leaving. He has the doubts that we all have. But he turns around. He follows his friends. They step forward. The shade of the canopy falls over them. The green wall opens up to accept them. The noise of the insects rises to meet them. They walk until the trees obscure their shapes. They walk until they are just shadows. And then they are gone. They walked off the edge of the world and into our dreams. They never found the city of gold, but they found something else. They found immortality. As long as there are people who look at a map and wonder what is out there, Percy Fawcett will never truly be dead. He is still there, just beyond the tree line, still marching, nec aspera terrent, forever looking for Z. The search is over, the legend is just beginning, and that is the story of Percy Fawcett and the lost city of Z. It's a journey that took us from the stiff collars of Victorian England to the trenches of World War I, and finally into the silence of the Amazon. It's a story about obsession, tragedy, and the thin line between bravery and madness. If you made it this far, through all 12 chapters, thank you, truly. These deep dives are a labor of love, and I appreciate you taking the time to walk this path with me. I want to know what you think. Do you believe the Kalapalos's story about the murder? Or do you think there's still a part of the mystery left unsolved? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe for more stories from the edges of history. I'll see you in the next one.